In the past, I would say that the most important thing in a camera is image quality, but these days it's way down on my priority list. Not because image quality suddenly doesn't matter, it still does, but because the low bar is now so high that it's not the limiting factor anymore. I mean, if you are unable to make compelling images with any of today's modern cameras, the camera is not the issue. Of course, there are better cameras, but as I put forth in my dynamic range video, the law of diminishing returns hits so hard in the camera market that each tiny step up in image quality comes with quadrupling the cost of ownership and production overhead. So these days what I'm looking for in a new camera is not more image quality, but more control over the image. If I own the camera, I want to own the sensor, meaning having full control over the pixels. And that really comes down to two things. One of the major issues with the FX6 that I pointed out in my review is the lack of a space-saving long GOP codec. Neither does the FX6 record 12-bit internally. And that means for every type of job out there, you are stuck with just one, albeit a very good one, all-I 10-bit 4K codec. And for the vast majority of stuff I do, it's the perfect middle ground, the Goldilocks zone. An XAVC being based on H.264 is really a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none codec. It's not very smooth for editing, it doesn't save that much space compared to H.265, and yet it doesn't hold that much information. The FX6 shoots 4K with the maximum bitrate of 250 megabits per second, which is not that much really. In fact, I would say that's on the lower end of acceptable for 10-bit 4:2 compression. But if I would shoot a short film, for example, or a product commercial, I would really like that added bit depth of a 12-bit codec, and without the hassle and the risk of external recording. And that need for diverse codecs works both ways, because for stuff like this, YouTube Talking Head, the all-I codec is just too much. It's an overkill for an almost static frame like this, and it really bogs down my workflow because of the file sizes. So again, a long GOP codec is very much needed, but you can get even more compressed than that. If you need to handle footage fast, an HAVC type codec can be a lifesaver, especially since in a lot of places network bandwidth is just not that great. So for my next camera I want a choice of codecs, both high, mid and low, all available for internal recording, so that I can adapt to the ever-changing demands of different sizes of productions. You know, a camera like Pixis or Ursa Cine that only records in RAW is just as limiting as a camera that only records in 10-bit. That's why I really don't appreciate Blackmagic Design moving away from ProRes in their newer cameras, and it seems I'm not the only one. That's why a camera like Canon C400 looks very attractive to me, with a whole array of internal codecs, all the way from 12-bit RAW with the choice of compression ratios, all the way down to all-I, long GOP and H.265 codecs. The second aspect of owning the sensor is of course OpenGate, and more broadly a choice of recording modes. It's all about more control, more choices. Having a 3x2 sensor in the FX6 and not being able to access the whole thing just feels wrong. I mean, those pixels are there, I own them, why can't I use them? There's been a lot of discussion around what constitutes a cinema camera as opposed to just a video camera, and I think that control over the recording modes is way high on that list. Because choice of lenses and framing is paramount in cinematography, you really want that freedom to choose which part of the sensor is active, especially since we seem to be moving towards larger and larger sensors. It's okay to have frame rate limitations in different recording modes, that's to be expected. Just let me use the whole thing. And Blackmagic Design is great about giving you those options, with Pixis having 7 recording modes and Ursa Cine having 10, as opposed to FX6's just 2, and if you are being honest, just 1 recording mode if you are not keen on shooting HD. By the way, that is why my next camera is likely to have a 6K or even higher resolution sensor, not because more Ks translate into better image quality, but because it gives you the opportunity to window in on the sensor while still covering the minimum recording resolution of 4K. The sensor's native aspect ratio is another one of those things that I'm looking closely at these days, whereas I wouldn't even consider that before. When camera manufacturers promise anamorphic support, they usually just mean the in-camera D-squeeze ratios, which is really the least important part. What you really want is a tall sensor and squarish recording modes. And that's another one of those things that puts cinema into a cinema camera. Short and wide 17:9 sensors like that on a C400 are way less attractive to me, because that means that anamorphic is pretty much off the table. I mean, technically nothing is stopping you from slapping on an anamorphic lens and hitting record, but you'll be throwing out a lot of information vertically while recording a bunch of black pixels horizontally. For a full-frame sensor at 3:2 aspect ratio is great, because it allows you to accommodate both the full-frame and Super 35 anamorphics with 3:2, 4:3 and 6:5 recording modes. The last little aspect of the whole owning the sensor idea is that I'm very averse to having in-body image stabilization, aka IBIS. IBIS is just bad news. It can really ruin a shot. And really, it was invented for the tiny small smartphone sensors and definitely not cinema cameras with full-frame sensors. That wobbliness around the corners and those sudden shifts of frame really destroy any kind of practical usefulness of IBIS for me. When a shot is ruined, I want to be damn sure that it's because of me and not because of malfunctioning equipment. And that element of unpredictability is precisely the reason why cinema cameras and IBIS don't mix. That very thing that you can't control between you and the sensor. Because even if the IBIS is turned off, it can still shake when the great enough forces are acting upon the camera. For example, when it's attached to a car rig or something. Another major con of IBIS is that it inhibits proper cooling. The sensor needs to be firmly married to a heat dissipation system that occupies the bulk of a cinema camera's body. And IBIS prevents any kind of real heatsink being attached directly to the sensor, because obviously it needs to be able to move freely. And that really puts the cap on how fast the sensor readout can be, as evidenced by the unacceptable rolling shutter in Sony Burano, aka the only cinema camera with IBIS. A $25,000 camera should not have these problems, so no IBIS for me, thank you very much. So there you have it, control of the sensor and more choices. And that's where I think the battle between the camera manufacturers will be moving forward, since they can't really compete on image quality anymore. And that capacity to scale up or down depending on my needs is really what I'm looking for in a camera these days. The perfect camera would be able to just as easily accommodate solo shooting run and gun scenarios, on sticks in the studio YouTube work, as well as bigger crew, bigger budget productions with intense post-production workflows. And with regards to anamorphic, that stuff is really more aspirational for me at this point, but we always want something we can't have, right? Thanks for watching.